Welcome, friends, to a journey through time, to a place where the streets are alive with the scents and sounds of medieval England around the year 1380. Imagine a bustling market town, somewhere between the rolling fields of the Midlands and the trading ports of East Anglia. Here, the air is thick with the smell of fresh bread baking, roasting meats sizzling over open fires, and faint whispers of exotic spices that have travelled thousands of miles to reach this little corner of the world. Tonight, we're diving into the strange and comforting world of medieval junk food, the snacks and treats that brought warmth and joy to common folk after long days of work, the surprising flavours that brightened festivals, and the curious concoctions born from necessity, creativity, and a hint of luxury. So settle in, breathe deep, and let yourself drift back to a time when every bite told a story of trade, tradition, and the simple pleasures that connected people across centuries. This is the world of medieval junk food, as you've never tasted it before. Chapter 1. A stroll through the medieval marketplace. Picture this. The year is somewhere in the mid-14th century. The morning mist still clings to the cobblestones as the first rays of sun filter down over the crooked rooftops of a bustling market town. You and I, we're standing at the edge of the main street, watching as the marketplace slowly comes to life. There's no hurry here, no reason to rush, so we can take our time, letting every sight, sound, and smell soak in before we take a single step forward. From here, we can see the long line of wooden stalls, some already open, others still being arranged by vendors with sleepy eyes and thick wool cloaks against the morning chill. A few cockerels are crowing somewhere off in the distance, their calls echoing faintly down the narrow lanes. The air smells faintly of wood smoke from hearth fires and the earthy scent of damp stone, but underneath, there's something else beginning to drift toward us, the warm, inviting aroma of baking bread. A baker at the far end of the street has already started his first batch of the day, and as the oven doors open, that yeasty, golden fragrance spills out like an unspoken invitation. We'll get there eventually, there's no need to hurry, but for now, let's simply stand here and absorb the moment. The cobblestones beneath our feet are uneven, worn smooth in some places by centuries of footsteps, and in others still jagged from where they were laid by hand. If you look closely, you can see where puddles have formed in the dips from last night's rain. Some of the stones are slick, so we'll tread carefully. People in this era don't have the clean, paved walkways of modern towns. Here, the streets are shared by everyone: people, horses, carts, stray dogs searching for scraps, even the occasional wandering goose. A cart creaks past us, pulled by a stout little pony with a rough, shaggy menere. The driver, bundled up in a patched cloak, calls out to a friend in a dialect that's thick and warm, words we might not fully understand but can still feel the friendliness in. Behind him, the cart is stacked with sacks of flour, perhaps bound for the bakers, and a few small kegs, which I imagine contain ale or cider for the taverns. As the sun climbs a little higher, the colours of the market begin to reveal themselves. Medieval towns can be surprisingly vibrant if you take the time to look. The faded reds of dyed cloth hanging from a draper's stall, the deep greens of cabbages piled high on a vegetable cart, the glint of copper pots catching the light. But here, in the heart of the street, it's the food sellers who truly draw the eye. There's an elderly woman setting out trays of little cakes, round, golden, and slightly uneven in shape, suggesting they were made by hand without molds. She works slowly, deliberately, her fingers moving with the practiced memory of someone who has done this every market day for decades. You can almost imagine her knowing exactly how many cakes she'll sell before the day is done. A few stalls down, a young man is tending to a small brazier, the coals already glowing red. Over it, he roasts chestnuts, their shells popping open with a soft crackle, releasing a smell so rich and nutty it seems to warm the air around it. He stirs them with a wooden paddle, humming to himself, the tune lost in the chatter of merchants and the occasional clang of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance. The market at this hour is not yet crowded. The early risers are mostly other merchants, buying goods from each other before the customers arrive in full. But here and there, townsfolk drift in, a mother with a woven basket over her arm, a group of apprentices on their way to the workshops, perhaps sneaking in a treat before their masters expect them. And that's where our journey into medieval junk food truly begins. You see, in this time and place, a junk food doesn't mean greasy fast food in paper wrappers. No, here it means something altogether different. Snacks and small indulgences that were meant not to fill your stomach, but to delight it. Foods that made you pause in your day, foods that you might eat on the go or share with a friend. Sometimes it's a roasted nut, sometimes a sliver of candied fruit, sometimes a piece of fried dough still warm from the pan. And unlike today, these treats aren't available all the time. They're special because they take effort, and because the ingredients, like honey, sugar, or certain spices, are costly or rare. Let's wander further down the lane now, slowly, step by step. We pass a stall where a young girl, perhaps no more than 12, stands behind a wide wooden counter. She's selling what look like small turnovers, their edges pinched together into neat little ridges. She catches our gaze and smiles shyly, telling us they're filled with cheese and herbs, a savory snack that can be eaten right there on the spot. The pastry is pale and soft now, but as she pulls another tray from a small portable oven behind her, the golden crust and fragrant steam rise up, carrying with it the scent of rosemary. Just beyond her, a bearded man is arranging his sweet goods. His specialty seems to be candied almonds, each one coated in a glossy shell of hardened sugar that catches the morning light like tiny jewels. He shakes a few into a paper cone, not the thin paper we know today, but a stiff twist of parchment, and hands them to a passing customer. The man pops one into his mouth, crunching down with a satisfied look. If we close our eyes for a moment, we can just listen. The sound of sizzling oil as someone fries a fresh batch of dough fritters. The faint jingle of a merchant's coin pouch as a sale is made. The murmur of conversation, some voices high and cheerful, others low and deliberate. A dog barks once, then again, as if asking for a dropped crust. Somewhere in the background, a church bell tolls the hour. The bell reminds us that in medieval life, time is measured differently, not by the ticking of a clock, but by the rhythm of the day, the opening of the market at dawn, the midday meal, the closing at sunset. And in between, these little moments of indulgence, a bite of something sweet, a sip of warm spiced wine, a part of what makes life feel, in its own way, luxurious. We'll take our time here, moving from stall to stall, letting the story of each snack unfold slowly, as if we have all the time in the world. Because we do, the market isn't going anywhere, and neither are we. By the end of this long journey together, you'll have walked the entire length of the medieval marketplace many times over. But for now, we'll simply linger here at the start, breathing in the mingling scents of bread, roasted nuts, and honey. Chapter 2: The Birth of Medieval Street Food. Imagine we have been standing at the edge of the market for a while now, quietly watching the town wake up, letting the smells and sounds seep into us like tea leaves steeping in warm water. Slowly, we start to walk forward, and I begin telling you about how all of this came to be. You see, in the earliest days of small European towns, food wasn't something you bought ready to eat from a stranger. It was something you made yourself, in your own home, from ingredients you either grew or traded for. Most families had their own bread ovens, their own small gardens, their own stores of dried beans, salted meat, and cheese. Meals were prepared slowly and eaten together, often after long hours of work. But as towns grew, as more people moved into closer quarters, as craftsmen and merchants filled the streets, and as travelers began to pass through more regularly, a new kind of food culture began to take shape. It started with the simplest of ideas. Someone, somewhere, realizing that if you made extra food, you could sell it to those who were too busy, too tired, or too far from home to cook for themselves. The first medieval street food sellers weren't chefs in the modern sense. They were often widows who needed to earn a living, or farmers who had surplus produce, or bakers whose ovens could bake more than their families needed. Sometimes, it was an innkeeper stepping outside to sell warm bread to travelers who didn't have time to stop in for a full meal. At first, the food sold in the streets was very plain: thick slices of bread, chunks of cheese, maybe a cup of warm broth. But it didn't take long for something else to happen. People began to realize that flavor could be part of the attraction. If you could make your bread sweeter, your nuts spicier, your pies richer, you might sell more. And so, medieval adjunct food was born. Picture it: a pot of oil heating over an open fire, the faint shimmer on its surface telling you it's ready. A ball of dough, rolled roughly by hand, is lowered in, and within moments it begins to puff and sizzle. The smell rises, rich, comforting, drawing people in like the scent of popcorn at a fair. The seller waits, turns it once, then twice, until it's golden on all sides. Then, with a careful hand, he pulls it out, lets it drain briefly on a cloth, and drizzles it with honey that catches the sunlight. This is not a meal to fill your stomach. This is a small joy, a luxury you buy not because you need it, but because you want it. That difference is important. It marks the beginning of a shift in how people thought about food. And these sellers, they didn't just offer food. They offered an experience. The marketplace was not just a place to shop for goods. It was the heart of the town, where you heard news from travelers, where you met friends, where you caught the eye of someone you hoped to see again. Eating in the market was as much about being seen as it was about eating. A small cone of candied almonds in your hand wasn't just a treat. It was a sign that you could afford such a thing, that you were part of the life and color of the town. Over time, as trade routes expanded in spices, sugar, and new ingredients arrived from faraway lands, street food became even more enticing. Exotic flavors could be found not in royal banquets, but right here among the stalls, for just a few coins. Think about that. A farmer who had never left his village might taste cinnamon from distant Ceylon, or sugar that had traveled across deserts and seas, simply by buying a sweet pastry at the market. Of course, the prices were still high for some. The poorer townsfolk might only enjoy such luxuries during festivals, or when a kind neighbor shared. But even the simplest snacks, roasted chestnuts, bread smeared with a little honey, or cheese tucked into warm dough, could feel like treasures after a long day's work. The smell of roasting meat drifts toward us now as we walk past a stall where a man is cooking skewers of spiced pork. The fat drips into the fire with a hiss, sending up little bursts of smoke that curl into the morning air. People gather, holding their coins ready, some eating as they walk, others lingering to chat. It strikes me that this is the true magic of medieval street food. It is shared. Not just in the sense of being given from one person to another, but in the sense that it belongs to everyone. In these streets, the blacksmith, the merchant, the washerwoman, and the traveling minstrel can all be found side by side, eating something warm and simple, united for a brief moment by the same flavor. And so, the street food culture grew, not from grand design, but from small, human needs: a quick bite, a sweet treat, a reason to stop and talk. Over time, it became as much a part of the medieval town as its church, its market square, or its city walls. Chapter 3: Fried Dough and Honey Drizzles. We've been walking for a while now, past the cheese pies, the roasted chestnuts, the spiced nuts, and the savory skewers. The crowd is a little thicker here, the air richer with the smells of cooking. People seem to be lingering in front of one particular stall, and it doesn't take long for us to see why. There, just ahead, is a table with a wide, shallow pan set over glowing coals. The oil inside shimmers faintly, the heat rolling off it in invisible waves. Behind the table, a man with a flour-dusted apron moves with an unhurried grace, his hands sure and steady. Beside him, a boy, perhaps his son or apprentice, stands ready with a bowl of pale dough. The dough is simple, just flour, water, a little yeast, and perhaps a touch of milk if it can be spared, but it's soft and elastic, the kind of dough that springs back under the touch. The man tears off a piece, rolls it between his hands, and flattens it gently before slipping it into the hot oil. The reaction is instant. The dough sizzles, bubbles forming around the edges as it begins to puff up. He uses a wooden spatula to nudge it, turning it once, twice, until the whole thing is golden brown. The smell is almost impossible to describe. Warm, comforting, a little sweet, with the faintest hint of nuttiness from the oil. Beside the pan sits a small jug of honey, dark, thick, and glistening in the morning light. When the fried dough is lifted from the oil and allowed to drain for just a moment, the man takes a wooden spoon, dips it into the honey, and lets it fall in a slow ribbon across the surface. The honey catches the light, tiny beads of gold settling into the crisp ridges of the dough. The boy hands it to a waiting customer on a square of parchment. The customer bites in, and I swear we can almost hear the crispness give way to the soft, warm interior. We wait patiently in line. After all, part of the charm here is not rushing. While we wait, I tell you a little more about this treat. Fried dough wasn't just a medieval invention. Variations existed in the ancient world. The Romans had their globuli, little balls of fried dough drizzled with honey and sprinkled with poppy seeds. But in the medieval marketplace, it became something special. The scarcity of oil, the value of honey, and the time it took to prepare meant it wasn't an everyday food. You might get one on a feast day, or perhaps if you'd had a good week at work and wanted to treat yourself. Sometimes, a father would bring one home to share with his children, breaking it into pieces so everyone could have a taste. In towns with busy markets, the smell of frying dough could drift for streets, drawing people in almost without them realizing it. At last, we're at the front of the line. The man tears off a piece of dough, his fingers moving with practiced ease. Into the oil it goes, and we watch it dance in the heat, the surface bubbling as it turns a deep golden hue. When it's ready, he lifts it, drains it, and drizzles the honey with a slow, deliberate motion, as though he knows this is the part people dream about. He hands it to us on parchment. The heat seeps through our fingers, the honey sticky and fragrant. We take a slow bite. The outside crackles lightly, giving way to a tender, airy center that still holds a little of the steam from the oil. The honey floods the mouth with sweetness, warm and floral, the taste deepened by the faint tang of the yeast in the dough. I can almost imagine the same taste being enjoyed hundreds of years ago by a merchant pausing between transactions, or by a group of apprentices laughing together in the corner of the square. For a moment, we are part of that same long chain of people, all of us drawn together by something as simple as fried dough and honey. We finish it slowly, letting each bite linger. Around us, the market moves on. More dough is fried, more honey poured, more happy faces walking away with their small treasure. Chapter 4. The Dusty Market of Forgotten Things. Imagine, if you will, that it is early morning in a small medieval town. The air is crisp, the kind of chill that makes your breath bloom into little white clouds in front of you, but it is not uncomfortable. Rather, it feels clean, like the air has been washed overnight. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the church bell gives a lazy single toll, announcing the hour to no one in particular. The cobblestones beneath your boots are still damp from last night's dew, and there's a faint smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimneys, mingled with something faintly earthy. That earthy smell? That's the market. But not the main market. Oh no, not the bustling square where farmers and merchants sell fresh cabbages and bolts of imported cloth. No, we are taking a turn down a much narrower lane, the kind that twists between crooked buildings like a path a mouse might choose. It's darker here, the buildings leaning inwards as if they are gossiping about you, and the smells are different. Here, the scent of bread is replaced by the musty tang of old cloth, the metallic bite of rust, and the faint, sweet aroma of beeswax polish. This is the market of forgotten things. The people who keep stalls here are not selling the latest and finest. Their wares are, for the most part, things that have already had one life, sometimes two, sometimes more. A cracked tankard, the glaze worn thin by decades of lips and ale. A chipped candlestick, its brass tarnished to a dull brown, but still serviceable if you squint past the damage. Patches of leather cut from worn-out boots, coiled rope salvaged from a ship long since dismantled, little wooden toys whose paint has faded until the faces look almost ghostly. It is, in truth, a junk market. And yet, and here is the thing, there is comfort in this place. There is no need to hurry here, no frantic haggling as you might see in the main square. The customers who come here are not looking for perfection. They are looking for possibility. One stall, for example, has a small wooden chest. The hinges creak, the lock no longer works, and the lid doesn't quite fit flush anymore. But to the right person, that chest could be repaired, lined with cloth, and made into a place to keep letters or coins or dried herbs. The seller here, a thin old man with a cap pulled low over his brow, seems in no hurry to part with it. He strokes the wood as though it were a beloved pet, and when you ask about it, he tells you, in a voice as creaky as the hinges, that it came from the house of a spice merchant, who once brought saffron from lands so far away that even the names sound like magic. Does it matter if that's true? Not especially. In this market, the story is as much a part of the purchase as the object itself. And this is the nature of medieval junk. It is never just junk. Every cracked plate, every bent knife, every spool of half-used thread has its own history. In an age before mass production, before the idea that one could simply buy something new to replace what was broken, people learned to see value where modern eyes might see only rubbish. A bucket with a split in it could still be used to carry hay. A worn-out tunic could be cut down for children's clothes. Even the most humble scrap of cloth could be rewoven into something useful, or at the very least, stuffed into the cracks of a drafty wall. Walking through the aisles here, you notice that many stalls are run by women, widows, often, who have become adept at collecting bits and pieces others no longer need. One might have a collection of spoons, no two alike, their handles bent and their bowls dented. Another might sell nothing but glass bottles, tiny ones for perfume, squat ones for vinegar, green ones that once held olive oil from the Mediterranean. There is a rhythm to this place. You pass a table covered in iron keys, each one heavy in the hand, their teeth worn smooth from decades of use. None of them have locks anymore, or perhaps they do, but those locks now sit forgotten in barns or buried beneath years of dust in manor houses. The keys themselves are sold not for utility, but for the hope that they might fit something. Buyers run their fingers over them, testing the weight, wondering what door or chest they might open. At another stall, you see a pile of parchments, scraps torn from larger documents. Some have writing in Latin, some in the looping script of the vernacular, others covered in crude sketches of animals or saints. These scraps are sold cheaply, often to be used in bookbinding or for wrapping small goods. And yet, every so often, someone might find a fragment worth keeping, a passage from a long-lost poem, a merchant's record of a forgotten voyage, or even a recipe for a medicinal potion. As you wander deeper into the market, the light becomes dimmer, the air more fragrant with the smell of old things. There is a quietness here, broken only by the murmur of voices and the occasional clink of coins. A boy runs past carrying a broken lute, its strings hanging loose, perhaps intending to repair it or at least strip it for parts. Somewhere to your right, a woman laughs, a warm, unself-conscious laugh, as she barters over a cracked ceramic jug. And this, perhaps, is the strangest comfort of all. In this place, nothing is truly worthless. Even the most battered object can find a new home, a new use, a new chapter in its story. And in a world where life can be uncertain, where fortunes change quickly and winters can be harsh, that is a kind of hope all on its own. Chapter 5. The Corners Where the Junk Lived. If you have ever wandered into the unused corners of an old building, a place where cobwebs sag from the beams like tired laundry and the air smells faintly of dust and the past, then you already know where we are starting today. Imagine it with me. The door creaks, the sunlight squeezes through in narrow golden ribbons, and there before us is a mound of, well, not treasure exactly, and not trash exactly. It's that peculiar middle ground the medieval world knew so well. In this chapter, I want to take you into those quiet corners, those back shelves, those low chests, where medieval junk lived its slow, uneventful life. You see, in the medieval home, nothing was truly gone until it had been reused, patched, reproposed, stripped for parts, or at the very least left somewhere just in case. These were the places where you found the broken hinge that might one day be mended, the old cloak that no longer kept out the cold but was too familiar to throw away, the chipped jug with a wobble in its base that was still a perfectly good if for holding dry beans. And so we step in. First, our eyes fall on a wooden stool, but not the sort you would actually want to sit on. One leg is shorter than the others, and the surface has a shallow groove worn in it from years of elbows resting there. If you were to ask why it's still here, someone might say, "Oh, we could cut it down and use it for the children." Or, it's good for resting the bread on while it cools. But in truth, it hasn't been touched in months. In the medieval mind, though, it wasn't waste. It wasn't there if you needed it. Beside it lies a bundle of frayed ropes, stiff with age, knotted in ways that might take half a morning to undo. Ropes like these once tied bundles of firewood or secured a cartload of hay. Now they are curled in on themselves like sleeping snakes. You and I might be tempted to toss them out, but to a medieval householder, they were still valuable. A shorter length might be just right for tying up a gate, or keeping the lid on a chest closed. There's a smell here, a blend of wool, wood, and faint mildew, and it takes me straight back to the market stalls we passed earlier. You remember those? The ones selling piles of a second-hand goods, except back then, a second-hand didn't mean bargain bin cheap. It meant something had lived a life already and was ready to serve another. This corner of the house is like a private market stall, only the customer is the same family, rummaging for something they need in a hurry. If you crouch down with me, you'll see under the stool a wooden ladle with a split in its bowl. Now, that split means it can no longer hold soup, but it's not useless. Oh no! In a medieval kitchen, that ladle might become a scoop for grain, or for pouring mash into the pig trough. The handle is smooth from decades of fingers, and the grain of the wood glows faintly in the light. I think I spot something else, half hidden behind a basket with a broken handle. Yes, a little stack of pottery shards. Someone has wrapped them in cloth, as if they were precious, but they are just pieces. Edges of what might have once been a jug, a bowl, maybe even a plate. They keep them because you never know when a bit of broken pottery might be useful. They could wedge a loose door hinge, scrape dough from a table, or patch another vessel with a smear of pitch and some careful work. This was the heart of medieval junk, the belief that everything had another life in it somewhere. And it's oddly comforting, isn't it? The modern world throws things away quickly, too quickly, perhaps. But here, in the low light of this corner, surrounded by mismatched odds and ends, you feel a kind of steadiness. You feel that these objects, worn though they are, have shared the days and the years with their people. They've been handled, carried, mended, and remembered. Look up, near the rafters. There, tied to a beam, is a bundle of goose feathers, not enough for a whole pillow, but far too many to simply sweep out the door. Perhaps they'll be used for arrow fletching, or stuffed into a small cushion. Perhaps they'll just remain here until someone needs a quill. And over there in the shadowed corner, do you see that? A wooden bucket missing its bottom. It looks like it would never hold water again, but turn it upside down and it's a perfectly fine stool for a child, or a safe place to set a hot iron pot without scorching the floor. We could stay in this one corner for hours, naming each odd thing, wondering about the hands that once used it. And that is exactly the beauty of medieval junk. It slows you down, asks you to imagine the long, humble afterlife of objects. Chapter 6. Gingerbread and Festival Treats. If you had wandered into a medieval town square during one of its many bustling fairs or holy day celebrations, you would have been greeted by a riot of smells, sounds, and colours, and among the most enticing of these would be the rich, spiced fragrance of gingerbread. Today, gingerbread often conjures up images of quaint Christmas biscuits or elaborate houses dusted with sugar snow, but in the Middle Ages it was far more than a seasonal decoration. It was an indulgence, a curiosity, a gift, and, in some ways, even a little miracle of preservation and spicecraft. To understand gingerbread in its medieval context, we have to step back into the markets and feast days of the era, into a world where sugar was precious, spices were the stuff of exotic legend, and food itself could be a token of love, devotion, or prestige. The very word gingerbread in the Middle Ages didn't always mean the baked biscuit we know today. In fact, in many regions, it referred to a kind of preserved, spiced paste, a mixture of breadcrumbs, honey, and ground ginger, often dyed with saffron to give it a golden hue. The earliest forms were closer to what we might think of as a soft, chewy sweet than a hard cookie. This wasn't the sort of thing that appeared on an everyday table. It was special, brought out during feast days, markets, and processions. In the stalls of a midsummer fair, you might see large trays of it cut into diamonds, pressed into molds with intricate designs, saints, animals, coats of arms, and sometimes gilded with a thin layer of gold leaf for the most impressive effect. It is difficult for us, living in a world where cinnamon and nutmeg sit unremarkably in kitchen cupboards, to imagine just how luxurious these spices were in the 14th and 15th centuries. Ginger came to Europe from far-off lands, India and Southeast Asia, by way of long and perilous trade routes. Caravans carried it through deserts, ships risked storms to transport it across seas, and at every stage it became more valuable. A merchant selling gingerbread was not merely selling a sweet. He was selling the idea of faraway places, the romance of the Orient, and the thrill of tasting something foreign and rare. For many townsfolk, gingerbread was the only way they would ever taste the East. The texture of medieval gingerbread was dense and sticky, closer to a firm marzipan than a soft cake. The use of honey as a sweetener gave it a floral depth, and the spices, ginger foremost, but sometimes also cinnamon, cloves, and even black pepper, gave it warmth and complexity. Some recipes instructed the cook to boil honey with breadcrumbs and spices until the mixture was thick, then to press it into wooden molds, which might depict anything from a noble knight to a devotional image of the Virgin Mary. The resulting blocks would be carefully wrapped in parchment and tied with ribbon, ready to be sold or given as gifts. It is worth pausing to note that gingerbread wasn't only for common folk seeking a rare treat. Royal courts adored it. Records from the court of Elizabeth I of England, though later in history, tell us she had gingerbread figures made to resemble visiting dignitaries. This playful, edible art had roots in the medieval tradition of mulled gingerbread, where the design was as much a part of the gift as the taste. In the 15th century, wealthy patrons might order large, ornate slabs of gingerbread to be presented at banquets, the designs proclaiming their status, heraldry, or piety. But gingerbread was only one member of a whole family of festival treats in the Middle Ages, each with its own story, texture, and significance. Festivals were not merely times of music and dancing. they were also rare chances for the palate to experience sweetness. Sugar, when available, was often kept for medicinal use or for the kitchens of the elite, but during fairs and holy days it might trickle down into the hands of the public in the form of special confections. One such treat was their marchpane, an early form of marzipan made from ground almonds and sugar, molded into shapes and painted with edible colours. Like gingerbread, marchpane was as much a visual spectacle as a gustatory one. On the stalls of a busy market square, you might see marchpane shaped like little castles, ships, or animals, gleaming under the sun. Children would stare wide-eyed at these sugar marvels, knowing full well they were far too expensive for them, but perhaps hoping for a small offcut or crumb to fall into their hands. Other festival delicacies included candied nuts, especially almonds, rolled in honey and spices, sugar-coated fennel seeds, known to aid digestion, and spiced wine called hypercras, sold steaming in wintertime markets. The aromas of these foods mingled in the air, the earthy warmth of ginger, the floral sharpness of honey, the resinous scent of cloves, the toasty sweetness of roasted nuts. Together they created an olfactory portrait of medieval festivity, one that would remain in the memory long after the stalls were taken down and the feast day ended. What makes gingerbread particularly fascinating, though, is the way it straddled the line between food and medicine. In an age when dietetics, the medieval science of food and health, was deeply rooted in humoral theory, ginger was considered a warming spice, good for digestion and for driving away cold humours. Physicians recommended it in small doses, and so gingerbread was, in a sense, a delicious prescription. This medicinal justification helped elevate it above mere indulgence in the eyes of the devout. Eating gingerbread was not simply self-indulgent. It was, some might say, sensible. The preparation of gingerbread also reveals much about the rhythms of medieval households. In the kitchens of the wealthy, making gingerbread could be a long, elaborate process, requiring the careful boiling of honey, the grinding of imported spices, the drying of breadcrumbs, and the delicate work of pressing and molding the finished paste. In humbler homes, the process was simplified, perhaps just honey, coarse breadcrumbs, and whatever spice could be afforded, but even so, it was time-consuming. This meant that gingerbread was bound up with the anticipation of festivals. Its making was an event in itself, part of the preparation for celebration. The selling of gingerbread at fairs also had its own social traditions. In some towns, gingerbread hearts were sold as tokens of affection, decorated with bright icing or small inscriptions. Lovers would give them as gifts during festivals, and some of these tokens were preserved for years as keepsakes. It's easy to imagine a young man nervously buying a gingerbread heart for the girl he admired, or a wife bringing home a slab to share with her family as a rare treat. These small gestures gave gingerbread a place not only in the stomach, but in the emotional life of the community. And then there were the gingerbread sellers themselves, figures of colour and character in the medieval marketplace. They might shout rhyming calls to advertise their wares, carry trays laden with fragrant goods, and bargain with customers over price and size. In some regions, they were licensed vendors, permitted to sell only during certain times of the year. The sight of the gingerbread seller was a sign that a fair had truly begun, much as the smell of popcorn might signal the start of a carnival for us today. Beyond gingerbread, medieval festival treats reflected a remarkable ability to turn limited ingredients into something memorable. Consider fritters, deep-fried morsels of dough or fruit, sometimes sweetened with honey or dusted with sugar if available. Or wafers, thin crisp biscuits baked between patent irons and served hot, sometimes with a drizzle of honey. These were the foods of celebration, of indulgence in a world where most diets were monotonous and plain. In the candlelit evenings of a medieval fair, after the music had slowed and the jugglers packed up, stalls selling gingerbread and spiced wine might still be open, drawing in people who wanted one last taste before going home. The warmth of ginger on the tongue, the sweetness of honey lingering in the mouth, these were simple pleasures, but in the scarcity of the medieval world, they were enough to make a memory last a lifetime. And so, gingerbread was not just a sweet. It was a fragment of the medieval imagination, a little edible piece of luxury, medicine, and artistry. It was a bridge between distant lands and local festivals, between the serious business of health and the joyful business of celebration. In every bite, there was a reminder that even in an age of hardship, people found ways to make life taste sweet. Chapter 7: Feast Days and Religious Celebrations. The medieval year was not a seamless march of identical days. It pulsed and swelled with moments of extraordinary disruption, days when the rhythms of work were broken, when the church bells rang longer and more joyfully, when the ordinary rules of fasting, labor, and even behavior could bend or vanish entirely. These were the feast days, the holy celebrations, the great markers in the Christian calendar that not only defined medieval religious life but also punctuated it with a strange blend of solemn devotion and earthly indulgence. For the average villager, these days were anticipated with almost aching eagerness. Life was unrelentingly physical in the Middle Ages: early rising, heavy labor, poor diets, drafty homes, endless chores, and so the prospect of a feast day meant more than just a religious obligation. It meant a reprieve. It was a day when the plough might stand idle, when the market was more than just a place for trade but a place of merriment, and when the dull greys and browns of everyday garments were punctuated by brighter clothes, ribbons, and flowers. The medieval calendar, under the Church's authority, was thick with these occasions. In theory, every Sunday was a holy day, a mini-feast of sorts, but beyond the weekly observance were the greater celebrations: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, Epiphany, and the various saints' days that dotted the months. Add to this the local feasts dedicated to a village's patron saint, the regional festivals tied to miraculous events, and the movable celebrations that depended on the moon or liturgical cycles. And one begins to understand why medieval people sometimes complained that there were too many days when work was forbidden. In fact, some medieval kings tried, with varying degrees of success, to limit the number of feast days because they feared too much idleness among their subjects. Yet to the people themselves, these days were a cherished relief. They were also, in their own way, a form of spiritual theatre. Each major feast was a public performance of devotion, staged with elaborate ceremony, music, decoration, and, crucially, food. Even the poorest villagers, whose daily diet might consist largely of coarse bread, pottage, and the occasional onion, could expect something richer on a great feast day. If one were to wander into a medieval town during such a celebration, the first thing to strike the senses would be sound. Bells were the heartbeat of medieval life, and on a feast day they rang with exuberance, their tones tumbling across rooftops, fields, and forests. The streets themselves were often strewn with greenery, garlands of ivy in winter, boughs of fresh herbs and flowers in spring, rushes spread underfoot so that the tramping of many feet stirred up a fragrant, earthy scent. Religious processions were common. Priests in elaborate vestments would lead the way, holding aloft relics or icons, followed by townsfolk carrying candles or banners painted with saints' images. In larger towns and cities, guilds often took pride in contributing to these processions, each craft represented by its members in their best clothes, sometimes carrying the tools of their trade in a symbolic gesture. The bakers might carry a great, ornate loaf, the smiths a polished set of ironwork, the fishermen a great net hung with shells and ribbons. But even as these processions moved with piety, the edges of the festival were often touched by noise and playfulness. Children darted alongside, trying to keep pace, merchants shouted from their stalls, and minstrels plucked at their instruments to catch the ears of passers-by. The medieval mind was not inclined to keep the sacred and the celebratory entirely separate. Joy, they believed, was a fitting expression of gratitude to God. Food, of course, played its central role. For certain feast days, especially those tied to the end of fasting seasons like Lent, the contrast in diet could be dramatic. After weeks of abstaining from meat, dairy, And eggs. Easter morning might bring tables laden with roasted lamb, fresh cheese, spiced cakes, and boiled eggs dyed with natural pigments. The symbolism was as important as the indulgence: lamb for Christ, eggs for new life, sweet spices for the exotic and heavenly. At Christmas, wealthier households prepared grand feasts featuring game meats such as venison, boar, or swan, accompanied by pies stuffed with fruit, nuts, and honey. Even in humbler homes, a Christmas feast might include richer breads, ale sweetened with honey, and whatever meat could be afforded or spared from the farmyard. It was not unusual for lords and monasteries to host great communal feasts, inviting the poor to share in the bounty, both as an act of charity and as a public display of generosity. Saints' days often had their own culinary traditions. St. Martin's Day, in November, was marked by the eating of roast goose and the tasting of new wine. On St. Nicholas' Day, children in some regions received sweet treats or small gifts. In harvest season, Michaelmas was celebrated with goose, apples, and sometimes a special bread baked with spices if they could be spared. These foods were not everyday fare. They carried with them the rare thrill of the extraordinary. Feast days also transformed the spaces where people lived. Churches, usually the visual center of a medieval community, were dressed for the occasion, altars adorned with extra candles, embroidered cloths, flowers, and sometimes costly borrowed vestments from a larger church nearby. The very air inside was changed, thick with incense smoke and the voices of choirs rehearsing their chants. Outside, marketplaces might swell with traveling merchants who had timed their arrival to coincide with the crowds. These days were opportunities for buying goods not normally available: fine cloth from distant towns, exotic spices, trinkets, and devotional objects. For villagers who rarely traveled far from home, a feast day could be their window onto the wider world. In some parts of Europe, especially in the later Middle Ages, certain feast days took on a carnival-like atmosphere. The Feast of Fools, for instance, allowed for a topsy-turvy inversion of the normal order. Junior clergy might dress as bishops, mock sermons might be delivered, and there was much laughter, dancing, and occasional scandal. Though frowned upon by more serious-minded church leaders, these bursts of disorder were tolerated, perhaps because they acted as a kind of social safety valve. The social importance of feast days cannot be overstated. They reinforced the communal bonds of medieval life. In villages, neighbors who might have quarreled over grazing rights or water access would stand side by side in the procession, exchange greetings, and share food. In towns, guild members renewed their sense of belonging through their public appearances. And for the young, feast days were occasions for courtship. The dancing, the games, and the general lifting of daily constraints created opportunities to meet and mingle. Even the rhythm of work was shaped by these days. Agricultural labor was tied to the seasons, and feast days often aligned with key moments in that cycle: post-harvest, pre-planting, or during natural lulls in fieldwork. This alignment ensured that people could genuinely take the time to celebrate without jeopardizing the year's food supply. For the deeply pious, the religious aspect of these celebrations was paramount. The Mass on such days could last much longer than usual, with elaborate liturgies, processional hymns, and sometimes the reading of miracle stories associated with the feast's saint. The sermon might be more expansive, and the offering plate might be filled more generously. Yet, as in much of medieval life, there was a constant negotiation between the sacred and the worldly. The Church saw these celebrations as instruments for teaching and reinforcing the faith. The people saw them, alongside that, as rare chances for joy, abundance, and human connection. Both views were true, and both shaped the reality of feast days in the Middle Ages. When the last candle burned low, the bells ceased, and the garlands began to wilt, the village returned to its ordinary work. But the memory of the celebration lingered, in the stories told around the hearth, in the taste of the last crumbs of spiced cake, and in the knowledge that another such day lay somewhere ahead in the turning wheel of the year. The medieval world, for all its hardships, was punctuated by these bright, strange, comforting days. They were as much a part of survival as bread or shelter, for they fed the spirit in ways as necessary as any meal. And in that sense, the feast days were themselves a kind of sacred nourishment, binding the community together under the sound of the bells and the glow of the altar candles, year after year, century after century. Chapter 8, or Winter Comfort Foods. Winter in the medieval world was not merely a season. It was a test of endurance, a time when the strength of one's preparations throughout the year determined whether the coming months would be comfortable or harsh. As the days shortened and the sun dipped low in the sky, frost began to creep along the edges of roofs, rivers slowed to a near standstill beneath sheets of ice, and the countryside seemed wrapped in a pale, almost dreamlike stillness. Yet behind closed doors, whether in the smoky kitchens of peasant cottages or the grand, firelit halls of manor houses, there was life, warmth, and the comforting aromas of foods that were meant not just to nourish the body, but to soothe the spirit. The concept of a comfort food in the medieval sense was very different from what it might be today. There were no steaming mugs of chocolate, no fluffy pastries layered with cream, and certainly no buttery mashed potatoes or sugary pies in the modern sense. Instead, comfort came from foods that provided heat, strength, and a sense of abundance in a time when the outside world was cold, barren, and inhospitable. The arrival of winter often meant a shift in the entire household's eating habits. Meals became heartier, richer, and heavier, designed to keep one full for longer and to provide the warmth needed to face the biting winds outside. The very foundation of medieval winter comfort foods lay in the stores of autumn. By late autumn, the frantic work of the harvest was over. Grains had been threshed and stored in sacks or wooden bins, salted meats hung from the rafters, barrels of ale and mead were sealed, and root vegetables had been packed carefully into cool cellars or buried in sand to prevent rot. A household's comfort during winter depended heavily on how well it had prepared during the warmer months. If food stores were plentiful, the season could be one of contentment and indulgence. If not, the days ahead would be a constant calculation of how to stretch dwindling supplies. Grain-based dishes formed the backbone of winter fare. Bread, of course, was central, dense, dark loaves baked from rye, barley, or a mix of whatever grains were available. In wealthier households, fine white wheat bread could still be served deep into winter, its flour carefully stored away from dampness and pests. For the poor, bread was often coarser, with bits of husk and bran left in, giving it a chewy texture and a robust flavour. In many cases, bread in winter was not eaten fresh from the oven but toasted over the hearth or soaked in broth to soften it, creating a warm and filling meal. Pottage was another winter mainstay, a thick, slowly simmered stew that could be endlessly adapted to what was on hand. In winter, pottage often took on a deeper, earthier flavour, as it was made from dried beans, peas, onions, and whatever salted meat could be spared. The rich, bubbling mixture filled the air with a savoury aroma that was as comforting as the taste itself. For poorer families, pottage might be mostly grains and vegetables, with just a hint of meat for flavouring, while the wealthy could add generous chunks of venison, pork, or fowl, along with imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, or saffron to give it an exotic warmth. Meat, for those who had it, was both a luxury and a necessity in winter. Hunting was difficult in the snow, so most of the meat consumed during this season had been preserved earlier. Salted pork was perhaps the most common, its fat content providing both flavour and energy. It could be boiled to soften it, then added to soups or served with boiled cabbage and leeks. Smoked hams hung from beams in kitchens, giving off a rich, smoky scent that promised hearty winter meals. In noble households, roasts were a centerpiece of winter feasting, great joints of beef, lamb, or venison turning slowly on a spit before the roaring fire, the dripping fat collected in pans below to be used for gravy or for enriching other dishes. Cheese was another food that became especially valued in winter. Hard, aged cheeses, stored in cool rooms or cellars, could last for months, providing a dense, nourishing food that paired well with bread and ale. In times of scarcity, cheese could even replace meat as the main source of protein for a meal. And then there were the sweets, or rather, the medieval equivalent of them. Honey was the primary sweetener, and in winter, it was used sparingly, sometimes stirred into warm milk or ale, or drizzled over baked apples. In wealthier homes, almonds might be ground into a paste and mixed with sugar, for those who could afford imported sugar from the Mediterranean, to create rich confections that were as much a display of status as they were a treat. Dried fruits, apples, pears, figs, raisins, were often soaked in warm spiced wine or used to flavor breads and puddings, their concentrated sweetness a welcome reminder of the warmer months. Beverages played an important role in winter comfort, not only for their taste but for the warmth they brought. Ale and beer were staples for all classes, but in the cold months, they were sometimes served warm and spiced. Mulled wine, simmered with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, was a favorite among the wealthy, while poorer households might heat cider or ale with whatever herbs they could find. Mead, fermented honey, was another winter drink, its golden sweetness a comforting luxury when nights grew long. The hearth was at the heart of all these meals. In the winter months, cooking was as much about keeping warm as it was about preparing food. Families would gather close to the fire, not just to eat, but to spend the long evenings together, talking, mending clothes, telling stories, and singing songs while the day's meal simmered slowly in a heavy pot. The flicker of firelight, the soft murmur of voices, and the rich scent of food all combined to create a sense of security and togetherness that was as vital to survival as the food itself. For the wealthy, winter comfort foods were also an opportunity to show generosity and hospitality. Guests might be served roasted swan or peacock, presented whole and elaborately decorated, or elaborate pies filled with game and seasoned with expensive spices. Banquets during the Christmas season could stretch for hours, with course after course of meats, fish, puddings, and spiced wines, a deliberate contrast to the austerity of Lent and other fasting periods. But even in the humblest cottages, there was a kind of magic in the meals of winter. A pot of pottage shared among family members, a loaf of bread baked with care, a jug of warm ale passed from hand to hand. These were not just sustenance, but moments of comfort in a world that could be unforgiving. Winter comfort foods were as much about the feeling they evoked as the nourishment they provided, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest days of the year, there was warmth to be found, both in the hearth and in the heart. Chapter 9. Exotic imports and spices for the commoner's table. Imagine yourself in the heart of a bustling medieval market on a crisp morning. The air is damp with the faint scent of straw and earth, mingled with the more pungent aroma of livestock penned nearby. The cobblestone streets are slick from last night's rain, and the voices of merchants rise and fall like waves in a harbour, calling out their wares in a dozen accents. This is not the place for kings or high nobility. This is where common folk, the backbone of the medieval world, come to see what they might afford, to barter, to gossip, and to catch glimpses of foods that feel like tiny miracles. Today, though, the air carries something unusual, the warm, almost intoxicating aroma of cinnamon drifting faintly from one corner of the square. Such scents did not waft through the streets every day. They were rare and fleeting, like the appearance of a comet in the night sky. For most medieval townsfolk, the idea of the exotic meant something almost magical. The world was far wider than the borders of their village, and the spices that found their way into these markets came from places so far away they might as well have been pulled out of a dream. Cinnamon, for instance, was whispered about in the same way one might speak of saints or relics, with awe. No one in this damp, northern town had ever seen the trees from which it came. The story might be told, in hushed tones over a candlelit table, that cinnamon grew in mysterious lands where the air shimmered with heat and the ground was red with dust, where strange birds sang in the branches. It travelled, in truth, thousands of miles, First across seas that few here would ever set eyes upon, then through scorching deserts, and finally along caravan roads where it passed from merchant to merchant like a guarded secret. By the time it arrived, wrapped in cloth and tucked into the pouch of a spice seller, it had passed through more hands than anyone could count. For the wealthy, the merchants who had grown fat from trade, the lords with their estates, cinnamon could be bought in small but respectable amounts to be baked into sweet breads or steeped in wine. For the commoner, however, acquiring such a thing was an event, a small triumph. It might mean saving for months, perhaps buying a few sticks for a wedding feast or a pinch to be sprinkled into a festival treat. When that small scrap of cinnamon was finally brought home, it was handled with reverence, stored in a little wooden box or wrapped tightly in cloth to keep its aroma from escaping. Cinnamon was not alone in its allure. Pepper, black as coal and sharper than anything most villagers had ever tasted, was another spice that could stir excitement. In an age when salt was precious and often monopolized by local authorities, pepper was an almost fantastical seasoning. A single peppercorn, ground in a small mortar, could transform a humble pottage of turnips and beans into something that tasted like a feast. And pepper, like cinnamon, was the result of a journey so long and complex that its price was as much about the romance of distance as it was about the spice itself. The spice seller in our imagined market, perhaps a wiry man with a weathered face and a keen eye for profit, would keep his goods in small wooden boxes or tightly sewn sacks. He might allow a potential buyer to sniff the contents, inhaling scents that carried them away to lands they had only heard about in stories. The merchant might speak of Alexandria, of Venice, of ships with crimson sails, of strange foods eaten with fingers instead of spoons. Whether all his tales were true hardly mattered. The very act of listening was part of the magic of the spice trade. And then there were the more unusual imports that occasionally trickled down to the tables of ordinary folk. Ginger, with its warmth and bite. Saffron, more valuable by weight than gold. But sometimes sold in pinches so small they seemed like the dust of a flower petal. And nutmeg, with its strange, almost sweet perfume. For the average villager, these were not pantry staples. They were dreams in powder form, tokens of a world beyond the horizon. What made these imports even more fascinating was the way they were woven into local customs and celebrations. On feast days, a family might take out their precious pinch of ginger and mix it into honey cakes, turning a simple sweet into something that lingered in the memory for years. At a wedding, a jug of ale might be warmed with cinnamon and cloves, filling the air with a fragrance that seemed almost holy. These were moments when exotic spices became part of the emotional life of a community, bound to memories of joy, warmth, and togetherness. Even the humblest households might, on rare occasion, find themselves in possession of a small packet of imported spice, usually acquired through some twist of fortune, perhaps as payment for a favor or as part of a dowry. In these cases, the family might not even use the spice at once. Instead, they would open it now and then, just to breathe in its scent, to remind themselves of the luxury they held. The smell alone could conjure visions of faraway places, the heat of desert sands, the creak of a ship's mast, the bustle of a foreign port. The irony was that much of what made these imports so treasured was not entirely about taste. Yes, they transformed the flavor of food, but they also transformed the way people felt about the meal itself. They were symbols of connection to the greater world, proof that even in a small village, tucked between fields and forest, one could partake, however briefly, in the wonders of distant lands. For commoners, the world of exotic imports was one they visited only in rare, fleeting moments. But those moments mattered. They broke the monotony of daily fare, offering not just flavor but a story, a sensation, a memory that could be savored long after the last crumb was gone. In this way, medievally junk food, it was not always about abundance. Sometimes, it was about a single, perfect taste. Chapter 10. Tavern Treats and Late Night Snacks. The medieval tavern was more than just a place to drink. It was the social hearth of towns and villages, the crossroads where news was exchanged, deals were struck, and the boundaries between work and leisure blurred. For the common folk, especially after a long day of labour, the tavern offered not only ale and mead but also an unexpected variety of snacks, simple, hearty, and often inventive, that made those late night hours feel warmer, richer, and more alive. In the flickering light of a smoky room, the smells of wood smoke mixed with the sharp tang of spilled ale and the sweet scent of freshly baked bread. The tavern keeper, a figure known to all in the community, would tend to the fires and keep the wooden tables cleared, but it was the food that often kept patrons lingering, filling the air with an undercurrent of comfort that transcended the cold outside. Unlike the grand feasts of nobles, tavern fare was humble but no less significant. One might find thick slices of coarse bread spread with butter or soft cheese, chunks of salted pork slowly roasted over the hearth's embers, or small pies filled with savoury mixtures of meat and herbs. These pies, sometimes called a cheesecakes or a savoury tarts depending on the region, were portable and filling, perfect for a quick bite between conversations or alongside a tankard of ale. The tavern's kitchen might also serve a version of pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables, legumes, and scraps of meat were available. This was a food that carried the essence of the season, reflecting the shifting harvests and the skill of the cook to coax flavour from humble ingredients. Often, this pottage was enriched with herbs like parsley or sage, picked fresh or dried from the windowsill garden. But perhaps the most intriguing of tavern snacks were the fried and baked treats, dough stretched thin and cooked quickly over a hot pan, dusted with honey or sugar for sweetness, or dusted with salt and herbs for a savoury bite. These early crackers or flatbreads were beloved for their crunch and their portability, perfect for eating while standing or passing between friends. Late at night, as the warmth of the fire softened the edges of the day, the tavern might also offer roasted nuts, dried fruits, or spiced cakes, small tokens of indulgence that brought a hint of luxury to the common table. These treats were often associated with festivals or special occasions but could occasionally be found on ordinary evenings, especially in towns near trading routes where imported ingredients were more accessible. Behind these foods was a rhythm, a pattern of sharing and storytelling, of rest after toil, and of a community gathered not just to eat but to connect. The tavern was where the medieval world felt alive in all its messy, vibrant humanity, and its foods were the comforting thread that tied it all together. Chapter 11: Sweet Treats and Sugary Delights, the Medieval Sugar Rush. In the medieval world, sweetness was a rarity, a treasure more valuable than gold to many, and sugar was the shimmering jewel in this kingdom of flavour. The word itself, is sugar, might have been whispered in markets and courts with a mix of wonder and longing, for it came from distant lands across deserts and seas, carried by caravans and ships in fragile barrels and sacks. To the average person, sugar was far from the everyday substance it is today. It was expensive, precious, and often reserved for special occasions or the tables of the wealthy. But despite its rarity, the craving for sweet things was universal, a longing that found many creative expressions in the kitchens and streets of medieval towns and villages. This chapter takes you through the journey of medieval sweetness, from the arrival of sugar on the European continent to the ways it was used to craft delicate confections, to the humble sweets enjoyed by common folk, and the very human stories intertwined with these sugary delights. The tale begins with the spice routes and the arduous journey sugar took from the tropics, crossing continents and cultures, finally landing in the hands of eager buyers who understood that sweetness was not merely a flavour, but a symbol of luxury and joy. From the courts of kings to the simple hearts of peasants, sugar shaped celebrations, healing remedies, and even religious rituals. The medieval sugar rush was about more than just taste. It was about connection, status, and the rare moments of pleasure that punctuated a life often marked by toil and austerity. The story of sugar in medieval Europe is as much a tale of geography and politics as it is one of taste. Originally derived from sugarcane plants grown in tropical climates, places like India, Persia, and later, The islands of the Mediterranean and Canary archipelagos, sugar was introduced to Europe through complex trade networks that linked East and West. The Crusades, for instance, played a significant role in increasing European awareness of sugar and other exotic ingredients. As crusaders returned home, they brought back tales of strange sweets and spices, tantalizing the imaginations of nobles and merchants alike. Sugar was first used medicinally, believed to have healing properties, soothing coughs and easing digestion, often mixed with herbs and rosewater. Gradually, it found its way into cooking and baking. In royal courts, sugar became a symbol of wealth and power. Elaborate banquets featured sugar sculptures shaped like castles, ships, or animals, edible art that dazzled guests. Confections called comfits, as sugar-coated seeds or nuts, were handed out like precious gems. Recipes were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of cooks and confectioners. For the common folk, sugar remained a rarity for centuries. Instead, they relied on honey and dried fruits to satisfy their sweet cravings. Honey, harvested from wild bees or small hives, was a staple sweetener, and mead, a honey-based alcoholic drink, was commonly enjoyed. Dried fruits like figs, dates, and raisins, imported via trade routes or grown in warmer regions, added bursts of sweetness to breads and cakes. In marketplaces, vendors sold simple sweets such as a marchpane, an almond paste sometimes sweetened with sugar or honey, and a gingerbread, flavored with warming spices and often shaped into decorative forms for festivals. These treats were both nourishment and delight, small luxuries in the daily lives of many. Beyond its culinary uses, sugar played a role in religious and social rituals. During festivals like Christmas and Easter, sweetbreads and cakes were baked with symbolic shapes and decorated with sugar. Weddings often featured sugar confections as part of the celebrations, representing fertility and prosperity. Medical texts of the time recommended sugar in various remedies, mixing it with herbs like mint or lavender. It was believed that sugar could balance the humors, the medieval concept of bodily fluids governing health, and its sweetness was thought to counteract bitterness or sourness in potions. The arrival of sugar also influenced the burgeoning trade economies. Cities like Venice and Genoa thrived as centers of sugar importation and distribution. Sugar refineries began to appear, especially after the Crusades, increasing the supply and slowly bringing the price down. This in turn expanded sugar's availability beyond the nobility, though it remained a luxury for most. The sugar trade intertwined with other commodities, like spices, silk, and precious metals, shaping the medieval world's economic and cultural landscapes. Sugar's importance was such that some rulers taxed it heavily, while others used it as diplomatic gifts or symbols of allegiance. Despite its luxury status, sugar was also a catalyst for creativity in medieval kitchens. Confectioners experimented with crystallizing sugar, making syrups, and combining it with nuts, fruits, and spices to invent treats that delighted the palate and pleased the eye. One popular sweet was their sugar cake, dense, rich bread baked with honey and sugar, sometimes scented with rosewater or saffron. Another was the marzipan, a paste made from ground almonds and sugar, molded into intricate shapes and colored with natural dyes, often presented at feasts as edible decorations. Yet, as much as sugar symbolized opulence, it also carried contradictions. Its rarity made it a target for adulteration, with unscrupulous merchants mixing it with sand or chalk to increase weight. Its sweetness, while cherished, was sometimes viewed with suspicion, linked to moral and health concerns by clergy and physicians alike. Medieval writers occasionally commented on the dangers of overindulgence in sweets, associating it with sloth or excess. Yet, the allure remained powerful, drawing people from all walks of life toward that rare, sparkling granule that transformed ordinary food into something magical. By the late medieval period, sugar cultivation had spread to Mediterranean islands like Cyprus and Sicily, increasing supplies. The Portuguese and Spanish soon began growing sugarcane in the Atlantic Islands and the Americas, beginning a new chapter in sugar's global story. But in the medieval towns and villages of Europe, the medieval sugar rush was still a slow burn, a tantalizing glimpse of sweetness in a world often harsh and unforgiving. Where a small taste could lift spirits and connect people across distances and classes. Through the sweet treats and sugary delights of this era, we glimpse not just a flavor, but a complex tapestry of trade, culture, medicine, and human longing, a reminder that even in times long past, the simple joy of sweetness held deep meaning. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Medieval Junk Food. How Old Flavors Shape Our Modern Palates. The story of medieval junk food doesn't end in the past. It is a tale that stretches forward, reaching into our kitchens, markets, and taste buds today. To understand how these ancient flavors and curious treats have shaped the way we eat now is to connect with a history that is both surprising and deeply comforting. Imagine, for a moment, sitting down with a plate of hearty meat pies, a slice of gingerbread, or a mug of spiced cider. These are foods that carry echoes of centuries past, recipes and ideas passed down through generations, evolving but never truly disappearing. The medieval world, with all its strange and comforting junk food, left a legacy that whispers through our culinary traditions. In this final chapter, we explore the surprising ways medieval junk food has influenced modern cuisine, how old spices and preservation methods paved the way for new tastes, and the cultural memories that linger in every bite. The dense, savory pies beloved by medieval commoners have their echoes in today's meat pies and pastries, found not only in Europe but also in places like Australia and the Americas, carried there by colonists and immigrants. The sweet and spiced cakes of medieval fairs prefigure modern gingerbread and festive cookies, their shapes and flavors still conjuring the magic of holidays and celebrations. Even the humble pottage, once a daily staple simmered over the hearth, is reflected in today's stews and soups, slow-cooked, hearty, and warming. The techniques of pickling and preserving continue to delight modern palates in fermented foods and condiments, a direct inheritance from the medieval pantry. But beyond the recipes, the medieval approach to food, its rhythms tied to the seasons, the blending of simple ingredients into rich flavors, the communal sharing around fire and table, resonates deeply today. As modern life grows ever faster and more disconnected from the cycles of nature, these medieval traditions offer a comforting reminder of food's true purpose: nourishment, pleasure, and connection. Through festivals, markets, and kitchens, the spirit of medieval junk food lives on, not as a curiosity, but as a vibrant thread woven into the fabric of our eating habits. From the spice that tingles on the tongue to the pie crust crisped by fire, every taste carries a story, an echo of a world both strange and warmly familiar. Consider the humble meat pie, a food both portable and filling, born of the medieval need to use every scrap and combine them in ways that were satisfying and efficient. Today, whether in the form of British pork pies, Australian meat pies, or American pot pies, this culinary concept remains a beloved staple. The flaky crust and savory filling provide not just sustenance but comfort, a warm memory of shared meals and simple pleasures. Gingerbread, with its aromatic spices and sticky sweetness, also has medieval roots. Originally made with breadcrumbs, honey, and ginger, shaped into decorative forms, it was a treat for festivals and religious holidays. Today's gingerbread cookies and cakes still echo these ancient recipes, carrying the scents and stories of past celebrations into modern times. The medieval love of spiced and preserved foods, born of necessity, led to culinary innovations that remain popular today. Pickling and fermenting, for example, have surged in popularity in recent years as people rediscover the flavors and health benefits of these ancient techniques. Sauerkraut, kimchi, and pickled vegetables all find their origins, in part, in medieval preservation methods. Seasonal eating, too, is a medieval principle experiencing a revival. The medieval calendar dictated when certain foods were available fresh, preserved, or best avoided. Modern farm-to-table movements echo this wisdom, encouraging people to eat with the seasons and appreciate the natural rhythms of food production. Medieval junk food also shaped social rituals that persist. Sharing food during festivals, the importance of communal feasting, and the joy found in simple, flavorful snacks are practices that cross centuries. In many ways, today's street food culture, with its casual sharing and vibrant flavors, is a modern reflection of medieval market treats and tavern snacks. Moreover, the medieval use of spices, once a symbol of wealth and status, has left an indelible mark on global cuisines. The blending of cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper into both savory and sweet dishes laid the groundwork for spice blends found worldwide today, from garam masala in India to pumpkin spice in the West. These connections remind us that food is never just about sustenance. It is about culture, identity, and memory. Medieval junk food, with all its oddities and comforts, teaches us about adaptation, creativity, and the shared human experience of finding joy in eating. As we finish this journey through the strange and comforting world of medieval junk food, it is clear that the past is not so distant as it seems. The flavors, methods, and stories continue to live, inviting us to slow down, savor, and celebrate the simple yet profound pleasures of food. So, the next time you bite into a spiced cake, savor a flaky pie, or enjoy a pickled treat, remember, you are tasting history, a delicious thread connecting you to centuries of people who found comfort, delight, and meaning in the strange and wonderful world of medieval junk